Light actually tires and shifts to the red just by simply traveling. We now know that. So the red shift doesn't necessarily imply, although it may imply the universe is expanding, it doesn't necessarily imply the universe is expanding. So the red shift doesn't necessarily support the Big Bang model either. Okay, I'm going to sum up this entire week with this one slide. And this was compiled by Dr. Henry Morris. Sir Isaac Newton spoke about the first cause. Everything has a first cause. For example, if a car stops, it's because it was first moving. Something caused it to first start moving. Something then caused it to stop. Everything has a first cause. Now, when we take a look throughout the universe, well, let's take a look throughout the universe and see what we see. When we look in the universe, we see limitless space. The first cause of limitless space must be infinite in extent. The first cause of unending time must be eternal in duration. The first cause of perpetual motion, planets in motion, planets orbiting, planets rotating. The first cause of perpetual motion must be omnipotent in power. You see where I'm going with this? The first cause is the Creator God. And when you look at the universe around you, not only do we see evidence of that Creator God, we see the character and nature of that Creator God, the Lord Jesus Christ. The first cause of unbounded variety must be omniscient, omnipresent in phenomena. The first cause of infinite complexity must be omniscient in intelligence. We saw just a couple of examples of the infinite complexity we see throughout the universe. The first cause of consciousness must be personal. Ooh. The first cause of feelings must be emotional. The first cause of will must be volitional. The first cause of ethical values must be moral. The first cause of religious values must be spiritual. The first cause of beauty must be aesthetic. The first cause of justice must be just. The first cause of love must be loving. And the first cause of life must be living. Ladies and gentlemen, that is the Lord Jesus Christ, the Creator, summed up in a nutshell. And if you don't know Him as your personal Savior, may I suggest that He died on the cross in your place, that you may spend eternity with Him. And that judgment awaits those who reject Him, just as the flood of Noah was cast as a judgment against the world that rejected Him. There is a greater judgment to come with eternal consequences. So thanks for coming out this week. It's been a real joy for me to be here. And we'll open it for questions. Okay, Ian had his hand up first. We'll try him. The what? The rock tablet. The green one. Oh, okay. Oh, you weren't here for that, were you? Oh, okay. That is a reproduction of a carving from a Cambodian temple in Cambodia. And if you look at it, it sure looks like a stegosaurus. 800 years old. How did they know what a stegosaurus looked like, seeing as how we've only known about dinosaurs for 150 years? Answer's pretty simple. They saw them. Yes, sir.
Does the sun shrink in circumference?
Okay. Does the sun shrink in circumference every year? This ties back to research that was actually carried out, I believe, starting in the 1800s. The Royal Observatory in England was actually measuring the size of the sun using a telescope. And what they deduced, what was figured out from all that, was the sun was actually shrinking in size. Now, new research has seemed to refute that, which only came out in the past decade or so. I've still got some questions about that because the original research, which is pretty straightforward, they took a telescope, they measured the diameter of the sun, and they did it all the time for years and years and years and years and years on end. That evidence suggests the sun was shrinking. So I still have questions remaining because I don't think they've actually thoroughly refuted this evidence. Personally, I don't use that anymore as an evidence. Excellent question, though, partly because the claim has been made to explain that. So. Anybody else? Yes? Were humans bigger before the flood? Okay, this came up a lot. I really dropped the ball last night, by the way. There was a lot of things I left out of the big picture that I missed. And we still went 20 minutes overtime. Were humans bigger before the flood? There are a number of reports that even I'm skeptical of humans being bigger in the past. I do personally think humans were bigger in the past. As a side note to that, do bear in mind the ark, the size of the ark was based on a cubit, which of course is the tip of the fingers to the elbow. So presumably the ark would have been larger at the time as well. Interestingly, in Australia there have been fossil trees found that were 150 feet from the bottom of the tree to the first branch. So the estimates are that that tree was some 450 feet long. So an engineering principle is quite easily solved in that Noah just simply built the ark out of entire lengths of trees. And so there's very few to no joints in the middle of the ark because you've got 450, 500 foot long trees to build the ark out of. So that's a major engineering problem solved just looking at the fossil record. Now, were peoples bigger? Some of the Paluxy tracks, which are kind of vague, probably human. Some of those have been huge, in excess of 20 inches long. I don't have casts of those, and I don't mention those, but there have been tracks of what sure appear to be humans. But you can argue against them, so we kind of don't use them. They could be, erosion or whatever. They have the correct pattern, the correct shape, but other people will just write them off. Now, there has been reports. I know Joe Taylor does an excellent job of this, reporting this in his book, Fossil Facts and Fantasies. He documents a series of reports of apparently large fossil human skulls that have been found, which Joe and I both agree. We think it's an exaggeration, but some reports of 45-foot tall human skeletons that were found. For instance, in China, digging up a highway or excavating for a highway, and they stumbled upon this giant fossil human skeleton. Was it true? Was it not? We don't know. It was lost to science. We can't verify it. So we mentioned it as a, what do you call that kind of report? It's an extraneous thing. Anyway, we mentioned it in passing, but that's about it. But in short, yes, humans were probably larger before the flood. As a corollary to that, if you guys don't mind my taking off for a second here on another rabbit trail, as a corollary to that, a question that comes up often is why don't we find more human fossils? Now, Dr. Henry Morris and John Whitcomb originally proposed that there was perhaps a population of 1 billion people at the time of the flood. John Wood-Morapee came back later on and revisited that assumption, and he actually placed it down around the 100,000 mark. And he based that on a number of reasons circulating around the idea that the human population was exceedingly wicked. For instance, child sacrifice obviously helps control the population, plays a major role in the population. Things like birth control, things like that. So he actually placed the number much lower, but he did the math and it worked out to like 1 human skeleton for every 6 cubic kilometers of rock or something like that. Anyway, the numbers were exceedingly small. Furthermore, people are very intelligent, and so they would tend to escape a flood, and when they eventually died, because they're mammals, they tend to bloat and float, and thus disintegrate. And so human remains would most likely be on the surface of the floodland and would not be preserved as fossils. So there's a variety of reasons to explain why there are so few human skeletons. Furthermore, as you saw today, often these skeletons can be disregarded because humans aren't expected to be in these rock layers. They're too old. Again, Guadalupe woman. How many examples of fossils are there out there that we don't know about that are tucked away in the basement of some museum somewhere? We don't know. The evolutionists and the evolutionary community are in charge of the paleontological research and what information gets out there. There's been entire books written on that subject. Forbidden Archaeology is a classic example. That's not a book, it's an encyclopedia. And it's nothing but story after story after story of people who made a discovery of an artifact or fossil that was not supposed to be where it was, and it ruined their careers. Ruined their careers. An entire book written on it. Jerry Bergman, Dr. Jerry Bergman, he's a member of my SIG. The guy's got 10 university degrees, 3 PhDs. The guy is absolutely amazing. And he is compiling a book right now on the prejudice and bigotry, the flagrant open bigotry towards anything questioning evolutionary dogma in academia. And by the way, April this year, it was supposed to come out right now, but they postponed it. There's a movie coming out called Expelled. You all familiar with Ben Stein? A couple of you are. If you've seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, he's the teacher at the front of the classroom. Anyone? Anyone? It was awesome. It was the only part of the movie I liked. Anyway, Ben Stein is the host of the movie. It is a movie strictly looking at intelligent design and anything questioning evolution getting kicked out of universities, colleges, the open, blatant bigotry. It should prove to be just a fantastic movie, and I'm going to catch it the first night it hits the big screen. Let me tell you, I ain't going to miss that one for the world. So that should be coming out in April. The movie's called Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. I love it. Anyway, anybody else got a question? Yes, sir. Excellent question. Will the new Earth replicate the old Earth before the flood? My friend Carl Baugh does think so. And he wrote, I can't remember which book it is. I think it was, oh, it's got a pink cover. I can even picture it. He wrote 2 books, Dinosaur, and then the second one that followed up on that. And he builds a pretty convincing case based on revelations, etc., that yes, indeed, the Lord will restore the Earth as it was before the flood. Canopy and everything. A very interesting case. But I would point to the book as the answer to that question. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
What about if it says the Earth was divided in the days of Peleg?
Right.
Was that before the flood?
That was after the flood. Excellent question. Let me just repeat it for the sake of the television cameras. He was asking about in the days of Peleg, the land was divided. Very interesting comment. Peleg was named because the land was divided. He was named after that division. There's been some discussion. Some have suggested that is when the continents actually divided. I would say that happened most likely during the flood. However, after the flood, there is a lot of evidence that the ocean levels were way lower than they are now. What I didn't touch on in much detail last night, those continents, as they slid apart and collided with other obstacles, then compressed and thickened. So now you've got this landmass that was spread out, has now compressed and thickened, gotten heavier, and is now sinking into the mantle and settling. This causes the mantle in the oceans to rise, which causes the ocean levels to rise. There's also water trapped after the flood on land that cascaded off the land over the centuries following. So after the flood, apparently the ocean levels were way lower than they are now. And if you take a look on that globe, you'll notice that every single continent, including Antarctica, if you drop the water, the ocean levels, I think by a mere 300 feet, you can walk to every single continent on the planet. There's actually a land bridge. And this comes to an interesting point that I know a lot of anti-creationists come up with. They say, oh, well, how did Noah collect 2 of every animal when they're on every separate continent? Well, answer is simple. They weren't on separate continents. That's before the continents divided. Pretty simple response right there. Secondly, a lot of anti-creationists point to marsupials being exclusively in Australia, and they say, well, they evolved there. You know, you creationists can't explain that. Well, yes, we can. It's quite simple. And actually, people probably took the marsupials as pets, is probably what the bottom line is. But this also brings up a problem for the evolutionists. The evolutionists agree those land bridges were there, but they claim they were there for millions of years instead of hundreds of years. So the question is a double-edged sword. Why didn't the marsupials go to North and South America? It's a double-edged sword. Now, coming back to Peleg, probably what happened in the days of Peleg, that was when the ocean levels finally rose high enough to separate the continents, and so the lands were divided. Others have suggested that that was when people made an agreement and they divided up the land amongst themselves. So that's basically the long answer to your short question. Okay, sorry, yes, sir.
You mentioned yesterday that people before the flood could sometimes run, I believe it was 200 miles without getting tired.
Right.
They can get a sore wound that could be healed in 45 minutes. What was it that kind of caused that?
Okay, and that's one place I dropped the ball yesterday, so I'm glad you asked. He asked about the effects of this supposed pre-flood world on the human physiology. Why could people run up to 200 miles? Why were open wounds healed so fast, etc.? The reason is because under these conditions, right now currently, the hemoglobin cells in our blood is the only thing that transports oxygen. And it saturates out at 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin cell. Under these conditions, hyperbaric, slightly enriched oxygen, the whole blood plasma becomes saturated with oxygen. And so you get all these dynamic physiological changes. So that's one area I dropped the ball. Another place I dropped the ball as well, we talked about, when you look through the scriptures, people before the flood lived up to 1,000 years old. Are those real ages? Well, we saw a tomato plant that outlived itself a 32-fold lifespan. Furthermore, experiments they carried out in that hyperbaric biosphere creation evidence museum, they used fruit flies. Fruit flies only have a lifespan of about 30 days. I think it's 28 days, actually. Yet, they tripled the lifespan of the fruit flies in that biosphere. Just in those conditions. That's all they changed. So again, longevity seems to be affected. Of course, the next question that comes up is, well, can we build a hyperbaric biosphere and live in it? Well, you could probably live in it, but the moment you try and leave it, this current environment suddenly becomes toxic to you. It's like from moving here to Denver. It takes a while to acclimate because it's a mile-high city, and down here where we're only a few hundred feet above sea level, the atmospheric change is quite drastic. That's why it's very hard to go up on Mount Everest, because it's so high, the air is so thin, that it's just really, really hard in the body. So for the same reason, if you live for a long time in these chambers, it can have an adverse effect when you leave them. So you're going to spend the rest of your life in them. They're not very big. Okay, anybody else? Yes, sir. What point did animals become carnivorous? That is an excellent question for which I'm not even going to, well, I will say they probably became carnivorous shortly, either at the time of the fall or thereafter. Now, because, put it to you this way, here's why I say that. The curse involved transformations, physiological transformations that took place. Thorns did not exist before the fall. So God did something as part of the curse. God actually changed the DNA of plants, and now they're growing thorns. So is it possible he changed other animals? I don't know. Possibly. Or possibly just the violence in the land just began to spread. I don't know. There is evidence of carnivorous activity from fossils, for instance. You see some bones that have been gnawed on. You can actually sometimes even identify the animal that ate the bones. It's possible they were just scavengers, or it's possible they were actually attacking and eating each other. One of the fossils I showed in the death pose, the first one that is on display in Vance Nelson's Creation Museum, he's got a big red arrow. If you look at the slides you get later on, got a big red arrow on it, and it's pointing to a fetus, which they're convinced it actually ate its young. It wasn't being developed in the mother. They're convinced it actually ate its own young. There's, even currently right now, sometimes, for instance, lions will inadvertently eat their young. And it has to do with a disorientation of the senses. It's not that they're deliberately going out trying to harm their young. They get a disorientation of the senses, and thus they attack their young. So it's difficult to say. And again, well, it's all just speculation. Basically, I wasn't there anyway, so I don't know. So, okay, Ian first. Yes, sir. Okay, they had carnivores on the ark. What would they be eating? That is one of the most common questions. Again, young animals aren't very aggressive, Secondly, if you get young ones, they sleep lots. Again, even animals that are carnivorous now can be trained to live off plants. Carnivorous behavior is actually driven by nutritional needs. There's actually been sheep that have been observed to become carnivorous when their nutritional needs were not being met due to drought. There's an island, I've forgotten the name of the island, and I couldn't tell you when the study was done, but I'm sure you could find it if you looked. Basically, it was this island that had some sheep on it. During droughts, the sheep couldn't get the proper nutritional value from the plants, and so they were actually observed to go and eat bird eggs and birds themselves. So sheep, which are normally not carnivorous, behaved in carnivorous ways because of a drive for nutritional needs. So during the flood, interesting, Barry Setterfield's wife, Penny Setterfield, made a lot of very intriguing speculations, again, speculation only, but she suggested that perhaps, for instance, spiders make webs to catch seeds, not flies and insects, but rather high-protein seeds before the flood. And so that was the whole point of a spider's web. And who knows what we may have lost at the time of the flood. You'll notice that Noah was given permission to eat meat after the flood. You'll notice after the flood was when all the lifespans drastically dropped. And the Lord specifically said, I'm going to limit man's life to 120 years. Something radically changed. The plants lost size. Is it possible that we had high protein, high nutrient plants like we have today, rice, beans, things like that? Maybe we had some other plants that were even more potent as far as protein and nutritional value than the plants we have today that were lost at the time of the flood. Who knows why? Maybe it's because of the environmental change. Maybe it's the loss of that canopy. I don't know. It's all speculation, but it was interesting speculation nonetheless. Yes, sir?
Is there any accuracy to carbon dating?
Accuracy to carbon dating. In the end, carbon-14 dating will probably be our friend and not our enemy. Carbon-14, unfortunately, has met with a lot of challenges. Again, there are the assumptions. We covered this. I don't think you were here during that day. We covered that in class the other day. But let me add on to what I said there. Carbon-14 has now been discovered with this new advanced AMS system. It is so powerful that they can virtually count every single molecule of carbon-14 in a sample. But the discoveries they made is because of that, they found out things like the carbon-14 blanks. These are rocks that are supposed to have no carbon-14 in them. And these were the samples they used to calibrate carbon-14 machines. It turns out even the carbon-14 blanks had carbon-14 in them. So with this new advanced high sensitivity system. And so all our carbon-14 dates have been thrown into question. There are assumptions as well, as I mentioned last night, if that canopy was in place, no ultraviolet light. No ultraviolet light means no carbon-14. No carbon-14 means if we find something that doesn't have carbon-14 in it, it could just mean it was from before the flood. And that's all it means. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's millions of years old. So, anyway. Anybody else? Yes, sir. Okay, why couldn't dinosaurs live after the flood like other animals? Personally, I still think there are dinosaurs still alive. I related some of those stories as to why I think that. But even the ones that have been supposedly seen are apparently much smaller than we find them in the fossil record. This lines up, of course, with everything else we find in the fossil record. But it would appear that dinosaurs have become extinct after the flood for a variety of reasons, man being one of them. For instance, in the Chronicle, I've forgotten the name of the Chronicle. There is a historic text out of England, roughly 300 years old, if I recall, and they talked about a two-crested dragon. And basically it was a dragon that came into town, terrorized the people, had two crests on his head, and basically they came after it with spears and stuff and drove it away. There's, of course, St. George and the dragon. When you read the descriptions and see the historic drawings, gee, sure looks like St. George took on a T-Rex. Again, you see historical records of dragons all throughout history that are most likely dinosaurs that people have killed off. It was a great noble feat for a knight to go and kill a dragon. Well, apparently these things existed. One report, it was well documented scientifically. Farmer was walking along with his cattle, they got startled by this strange creature that was on the side of the road hissing at them. And he bonked it on the head and killed it and took it to these scientists. Well, nobody knew what it was, but they called it a dragon. So what was it? I don't know, but apparently it was preserved and everything, and nobody knows where it is today. But the point I'm making is dinosaurs probably were still alive up until recently, may still be alive today in remote areas of jungles like the Congos of Africa. The natives there in the Congos are terrified of these things. They call it Mokele Mbembe. They claim that elephants, rhinoceroses, and hippopotamuses stay away from this area because of Mokele Mbembe, whatever this thing is. My good friend Bill Gibbons, on their last expedition, they went up this river, saw nothing on the banks. When they came back down, there was these strange mud mounds that weren't there when they went upstream. And they were getting into the dry season. So they came up to investigate them, and there was holes in the mud mound, and there was something in the mud mound breathing, something big. And so while they were standing there discussing it, whatever this was woke up and started digging its way out. And so the natives freaked out. They grabbed Bill, they forced him into the boat, and they took off. So it's stuff like that, where they get this close and something happens and they get dragged off, or the camera breaks, whatever. It's just, I'm so sick and tired of hearing these stories. And that's why, even though I've been invited on these expeditions, I sit there and wonder, does God not want these discovered yet? What's the scoop? You know? And I hate to say it, but even in the end, even if we produced a living brachiosaurus, I don't think it would change the evolutionist mind's one iota. Why? Look at the coelacanth. Supposedly extinct since the time of the dinosaurs. Oh, now they're still alive. Isn't it amazing they've survived all these hundreds of millions of years? Didn't change the views one iota. So I don't think finding a living pterosaur or a living dinosaur will change it at all, but still would be a pretty spectacular find. So,
Ian, you claim the Indonesian tsunami made 3 to 5 layers from one wave. You got a reference for that? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do have a reference for that. Now, this all started at the 2005 GSA, the Geologic Society of America meeting. It was Dr. Andrew Moore and his team. The article was Sedimentation from the 26th December South Asia Tsunami in Northern Sumatra, Indonesia. Now, secondly, if you watch the video series, I showed you this photograph. These were triplets, or multiple layers made by one wave. Every single one of those sequence of 3 layers was made by one wave. And any junior high school student can replicate this at home. It's not hard to do. So we verified, even by experimentation in the lab, that one wave can produce 3 to 5 layers.